Okay, good afternoon. Good morning, sorry. It's like the afternoon anyway. Okay, so today we're going to begin a little bit something that's a little different, but it's not totally different. I've already spoken about this before, and you can see some of the elements here I will expose today that I have already mentioned before in the previous lectures. And it has to do with questions of history, right? And literature. It's a theme, it's a common theme in literary studies, history and literature. And so there are many ways of dealing with this question of history and literature. There are, at least, broadly speaking, there are four ways of talking about it, or four ways of approaching the subject. The first one considers that literary text belongs to no particular time, and you will see what this refers to. They are universal and transcend history. In other words, like a text from, from 5,000 years ago is still the same as it was then. Today we can read it, and it's beyond history, beyond time. It's universal, it's eternal, and so we can read it anytime, right? And it contains whatever references it has to that time, we can still find them, etc. In other words, we don't read the text in its context, but we read it as a text that's transcending time and context, right? And we read it just for pleasure or something. Like, for example, you take Shakespeare, the plays of Shakespeare, and you can watch them today, or you can even play them today, or read them, and you will still get the sense of what Shakespeare was talking about at that time, okay? They are universal, transcend the history. The historical context of their production and reception has no bearing on the literary work, which is aesthetically autonomous, having its own laws, being a world unto itself. And this, can you guess what approach this is? Can you guess which kind of which school of literary criticism has these ideas about texts? Look at the words, the main ideas in there. The historical context has no bearing, has no importance, changes nothing. It's neocriticism. Neocriticism is the one that says that every literary text is a world in itself. It doesn't need anything else outside of it, right? These are the people who say there is nothing beyond the words in the page. What we have is what we have there. We don't need to bring any historical record or any biography or any elements from the life of the author or anything to understand the literary text, because, for example, you read Shakespeare, you read any play or poems by Shakespeare, and you don't need to know anything about Shakespeare before you do that, right? And when we study Shakespeare, for example, most of the time, or any text, by the way, we don't even talk about the author's life. We don't say anything about his history, his time, or history in which or the period, the context in which the text was written. We don't care. We just read the text for what it is, and we look for the elements, the aesthetic elements, what makes it beautiful, what makes it interesting. We look at the symbolism, we look at the connections, the tropes, all the things that make the text whatever it is. I mean, in other words, we consider it as an aesthetic object, just like a painting. Right? When you have a painting in your house, you look at a painting, but you don't care about who did it, or the history of who did it, or when it was produced, because it's a painting, it's there, it's beautiful, and you look at it as a beautiful thing, right? Not just a painting, it could be anything. It could be a statue, it could be any work of art. And so they consider in the same way, literature or literary texts are aesthetic objects, right? They're beautiful things that we have and we enjoy just for the experience of it, right? This is the general way of dealing with literary text and also with art.
You can listen to music today. For example, you can listen to, I don't know, to Mozart or Wagner or whatever, and you listen to music. You listen, because it's aesthetically appealing, right? You find some pleasure in listening to the music without caring when or how or whatever the history is. You listen to music and that's it. And not just Mozart or anything, it could be any music for that matter. Because it's an aesthetic experience. In other words, you enjoy it, you listen to it. If you like it, you feel something about that. And so that's the idea. This is to say, like any form of art, literature is also in the same way, beyond history, beyond time, beyond context, beyond all of those things. Right? That's the comment. It's very appealing. It's very nice also. It's something that we do. It's very good for teaching. If you become a professor or a teacher, you would be doing the same. You would be teaching your students to look at the text and read it carefully, closely, do the close reading. If you're looking at a painting, you would want to look at the details and everything and find out what makes it special. Why is it that's so special about that? For example, you've read lots of short stories in your curriculum from S1 to now. And you read the short stories without really paying attention to the history of the short stories, right? You have, right? And so because you want to see what's so interesting about them, what do they have to say? And it doesn't matter who wrote them or when or the historical circumstances or anything. That's the idea. The idea is that of neocriticism and formalism in general, we call it formalism because it pays attention to the form, to the plastic form, like art. Right? Plastic means the surface, the things that we have there in front of us, the shape. Just we do the same with music, we do the same with art in general, and also literature. It's the same. Okay, it's the same kind of approach. You enjoy it for what it is. For example, you go to a museum or to an art exhibit and you find abstract art. And abstract art is basically the void of content. That's why it's called abstract, because there is no content. And it asks you to put a content in it yourself. It's not symbolism, it symbolizes nothing. You just have to look at the shape, the patterns, the form, whatever there is. Even if there is no pattern, there is still a pattern. Even the absence of a form means also a form. Okay? And you watch, and you look, and you look at that, and that's it. You don't need to interpret it. There is no interpretation. It's beyond interpretation, beyond all of that stuff. It consists of what is on the canvas. The colors, the forms, the things like that. That's it. Okay? All right, so that's concerning the form, paying attention, focusing on the form. And when you do that, you are a formalist. Formalism is the school of criticism that focuses on forms of literary texts or artworks in general. Okay? That's the one. The second is the historical context of a literary work. In other words, the circumstances surrounding its production, is integral to a proper understanding of it. In other words, this is the total opposite. It's the one that says that you cannot read it, you cannot understand it without referring to the context in which it was produced. In other words, very important, the context is important in understanding the text itself or the artwork itself. The text is produced within a specific historical context, but its literariness, it remains separate from that context. In other words, even though it is produced in certain circumstances, that formal aspect of it that makes it different is not related to the history. In other words, form is not related to the context. What is related to context is only the circumstances in which it was written, and so it may have references to events, to history, to actual persons or historical figures, etc. But the special thing, what we call literariness, for example, the aesthetic part, right, is not related to that context. You understand? So the context is important to understand the text, and it does not have a bearing on the form itself.
Is this clear? Or you want more explanation? If you ask me questions, I can give you more, right? Your questions trigger ideas in my head. So if you don't ask me questions, I will not be able to give you more than I have already said, because for me it sounds obvious. Okay? So it's the opposite of the other one. Yet it is also related to it. The first one, the first school, the new criticism, the formalist school, says that the literalness, the part of it that makes it special, right, is in it, it's there. That's the most important part. But the historical part says no historical context is important here. This one says no, it is very important to read the historical part. But it's also important to read the special things in the artwork, its form. Right? What makes it aesthetic? What makes it beautiful? What makes it different from others? Right? All right, okay. We'll see, but there is more coming, don't worry. The third one is the literary works can help us to understand the time in which they are set. Realist texts in particular provide imaginative representations of specific historical moments, events, or periods. Right? The third one says basically that the literary text is a historical document. Right? You read, for example, Shakespeare, and you try to find out what happened in England at that time. I mean, you would see, not just in England, but whatever it is talking about. For example, Hamlet is about Denmark. Right? It's supposed to be set in Denmark, because Hamlet is a prince of Denmark. Right? Or Othello is a prince of, I don't know what country. He's from Morocco or somewhere in North Africa, but but the story is taking place in Rome, I think, or something. But there is always like historical things in the text. So in other words, if you're a historian and you're reading about, and you're trying to, you can also go to literary texts, stories, etc., and you find elements of history that you can use to write a historical account of a certain period or of a certain place, right? So we're coming into more details about these. So these are like the first one is a literary text considers that literary texts are bound up with other discourses and territorial structures. They are part of a history that is still in the process of being written. This one says you cannot distinguish between the text and the traditions in which, or the narratives and discourses in which it appeared, or with which it was concomitant, happening at the same time, right? So not only the form, but also the ideas and everything that it says are related to its time. So we can read it, and when reading it, we read also the texts that are around it. It is determined by whatever has been done, practiced, all the cultural, social practices of the time, ideological, political, whatever you call them, economic, social, are determinant in understanding the big picture. To read it, you have to have the big picture. Not just reading the historical part, but it says something about the time. In other words, the literary text becomes an analysis of the word what we use usually is episteme. In other words, the system of knowledge of the period. I thought I would use this word before. I don't know if you can see this down here. Okay? It's knowledge. It's basically the systems of knowledge, right? And this is something that, this is a theory that relates to Michel Foucault, the French critic, French historian of ideas and philosopher, Michel Foucault. It's called an episteme. In other words, you read Shakespeare and you get something about how people thought at the time. What the kind of thinking that was happening there, or the way that people saw the world, the different ideologies of the time, the different things. In other words, all the human, all the infrastructure, the superstructure, the ideas, right? The ideas, the worldviews, the general, let's say, way of thinking and of behaving and of relating, etc., and of viewing the world and of constructing and understanding the world are part of the text, and the text can tell us that, can give us an idea of how things were done or how they were thought about at that period. Okay? Okay, now I come to put like labels on those different schools. The four models of literature, history, and history characterize various schools of criticism. The first is associated with neo-criticism, like you said, right? Or more generally with formalism. The second model is the kind of approach favored by philological, or what we might call background critics, also called historical criticism. Such critics are concerned to describe and analyze literary texts through a consideration of their historical background. In other words, you want to see the background of the text that you're dealing with, where it came from. The third model tends to be associated more with traditional historical scholarship than with literary criticism. It's assumed, this is where I told you that the literary text becomes a historical document. So it's like a historical approach to literature whereby you're looking for history in literature. You're trying to see it as a historical document. Right? It assumes that literary texts are in some respects subordinate to their historical context. Right? You know, in other words, they cannot be understood outside of their time. And the last one, the fourth, I don't know, is this clear? The four schools that we talked about, right? The last model is associated with a new kind of concern with the historical dimensions of literary studies, particularly since the early 1900s. This model is specifically associated with new historicists, critics, it's called new historicism, right? Or cultural studies. We also call them cultural studies. If you heard about cultural studies, this is what it means, right? They're called new historicists or new historicism. In the US, they call them that, and in England, they call them cultural materialists or cultural materialism, or also cultural studies, basically. Most of the cultural studies was based on Marxist theory, right? It was like a Marxist theory, Marxist approach to questions of culture in general. And so it basically speaks about relations of power in society. So every text produced in society speaks power, talks about, but there is always, let's say, it's like, you know what's a watermark? The watermark? Huh? Watermark is you have, for example, money. You see, you have a bill. You take 100 dirhams bill, etc., and you look at it, and you see a picture inside that's not apparent on both sides. It's apparent when it's inside. So the picture that's inside, it could be a symbol, it could be a slogan, it could be a picture, for example, of the king and the money in 100 or 200 dirhams bill or whatever, etc. They say that's like this is like it. So that's what you call a watermark. And so power is like a watermark in all of those things. In all of text, according to the materialists, right? According to new cultural studies, it's about different, and how power basically disguises itself, and we don't see it. And so they pay attention to ways in which power is inserted in ways that are sometimes not even conscious. We don't even pay attention to that. But remember, we talked about this a lot. Remember that poems we talked about in the beginning, the Ozymandias? I talked a lot about that. That's the kind of thinking that they do, right? They say it's all about power, and power is everywhere, because power is permeating everything. It's omnipresent. And so you can find it in every text that we talk about. Okay? Any questions so far? If you want, this is like at the same time we're starting something different, a different way, but we are also relating it to something we did before. And at the same time, it's like another way of summarizing what we have done until now. Just remember that most of what I was focusing on was reader response, right? I was basically focusing a lot on what we call reader response. In other words, how the readers make sense of all this. As you can see, all the four forms give preeminence to the reader. It's the reader who does all that. Whether you are reading historically or not historically, whether you are reading in this way, that way, or the other way, you are still a reader who makes sense of the text. The meaning stays with you. It's you, and it's up to you to decide which way to see the text. Okay? This is not completely different. In other words, what I'm saying is that everything is connected. You can't have, don't think in ways that there are compartments, that every school is a compartment. They are all connected. Everything is connected. You cannot separate them. You can't talk about one without the other. They're connected and they make one. It just shows you that criticism is so diverse and so, but it's all interdependent. Even if you're doing historical criticism, you will still have to look at the form, because you will still find the form itself as proof or as evidence of your argument to defend or to support your argument that you want to say, because it's all there. Right? And so that's why the reader is extremely important in this. Whether you are post-structuralist, deconstructionist, or whatever you call yourself, semiotician, etc., it's still the reader who does the job. It's very important to remain this. It's all on the reader. In whichever way you read the text, it's you who are doing the reading. You who are doing the meaning making. In other words, meaning happens only in our heads, when we read. Right? It's not in the text. It may be in the text. We can consider that. But even if it's in the text and you're able to extract it, you still are the one who extracted it. And you will shape it in your own words, and you will shape it in your own way of seeing things. Right? But it doesn't mean that all readings are equal, are the same. There are good readings, bad readings, terrible readings, and excellent readings. It just depends on how much intelligence you're putting into your work. Like anything else, like a carpenter. There are good carpenters, there are terrible carpenters, there are excellent ones. You can ask 5 different carpenters to make a chair, right? You can give them a model, or not even a model, just make a chair, okay? I'll give you money, just make a chair. And you will have 5 different chairs. One will be good, one will be bad, one will be terrible, one will be completely stupid, and one will be excellent, maybe. Or at least too good, or at least very good, or something like that. So it's the same. Basically everywhere, it's the same. And so do not think that you can separate these knowledges. Do not think that you can separate what you have learned from S1 until today from what you're doing today. It's impossible to do. If you do that, then you are not doing anything. You're just reading for exams. And by the end, when you leave everything behind you. Everything you learn stays in the classrooms and the notebooks, but not here. It's not about ideas, it's about skills. Connecting things is a skill. Having a synthetic mind, right? Synthetic. In other words, you synthesize. In synthesis means you bring things together, connecting things and make them in a sort of having a complete vision of things. And that's the thing. This is what criticism teaches us. And that's what we call critical thinking. That is the sense of critical thinking. Not saying no, not criticizing. There is a difference between criticizing someone and critiquing someone. When you critique, you are analyzing, you're discussing, you argue. An opinion is not an argument. If you think this is my opinion, well, it's just an opinion. You need to turn your opinion into an argument. In other words, an opinion is something that you don't need to defend. You say, it's my opinion. I think you're stupid. It's my opinion. But if I insist, tell me how you think I'm stupid. What makes you think I am stupid? Then you will have to make an argument. Then you are moving beyond judgment, opinion, into argument, into analysis, into discussion, into a conversation. And that makes the difference. Right? So an opinion is not when you write opinions in an essay, it's not good. You have to turn them into arguments. In other words, you have to use logic, you have to use reason, right? You have to defend them, you have to use rhetoric, you have to use all kinds of elements of language that will defend it, that will make it strong, so that you can convince the others with it. That's why it's called rhetorical. rhetoric. You understand rhetoric? You know, there is something now we call rhetorical studies. It's if you maybe how do you write that? Yes, like this. The general term of the thing is called rhetoric, right? I can't tell you what it is in Arabic because I don't know, or maybe I do. Huh? I think the balagha or fasaha. El balagha, yes, the balagha. Thank you, balagha. Right, in French, balagha. But what is we never? I studied. I was at school and we learned about balagha, but we never understood what it meant. I did not. I had lousy teachers. They did never explain to us what balagha means. We just thought that using good words, big words. But it is not. It's actually arguing. It's what, as a lawyer, good lawyers are the ones who make good arguments. And they study this. I mean, I don't know in Morocco what they study. Maybe they don't study anything. But in other countries, in the United States, for example, if you're studying to become a lawyer, they will give you a case in which you will have to defend someone, right? And they will give you the same case, and you will have to destroy that same person. You have to do two things. Defend them with a good argument to convince the jury, because it's a system of juries in America. You have to convince the jury to say he is innocent or she is innocent. And at the same time, you say, okay, now we have do the opposite and convince the jury that this person is guilty. And they judge you on your capacity to do that. How convincing can you become? Right? You may think this is unethical, this is bizarre, because you say, how can you defend someone who's guilty? But that's not the idea. The idea is that everyone has a right to a fair judgment. And everyone has a right to, what we call mitigating circumstances. In other words, there is always something around something that the crime that happened that may mitigate, that, it's not an absolute crime. It is a crime, but you try to find so that you can, if you can save the person's life, at least, give them a lesser sentence than the death penalty, for example, in cases where the death penalty is required. Anyway, so it's rhetoric, right? And so when you write an essay, for example, about the topic I give you in the exam, you have to be able to convince me that your argument is actually sound, right? That it's sound. You understand sound? Solid, right? And it's not weak. If it's a weak argument, then it's just an opinion. Anyway, this is what we learn from criticism. And all of this thing is about this. The whole thing that we've been doing since the beginning is this, that you open your mind, that you have to think about a million things at the same time, that you can connect everything you know, that connect things and not just read like that as a machine. There is a machine reading, but machine reading is only reading. It's just a voice. We need to know the mind behind the voice, the brain behind the voice. All right, okay, let's move on to something. So, this is about neuroaestheticism, okay? In here. This model is with, materialism or new historicism, as we say, and in both cases, this new interest in history has been refracted through the concerns of both Marxism and post-structuralism to produce a complex model for the literary, what is the literary, or for the literary, in other words, for that which we consider literary. Okay, so we have these two important things, Marxism and post-structuralism are two different schools, but they're connected also, that have this new way of looking at history, of considering the past, considering cultural production from perspective of history and also from a historical material. We call it material in the sense that it relates to life, to people's life, the real life of people, and also that it is not like meta-historical, like beyond history or anything. It is related to circumstances, basically related also to economic conditions, social conditions, etc. That's what we call it materialist. Materialist in the sense that it relates to our material life as people living in society, And as people living in different conditions, right, in different circumstances, of class, of economy, of politics, of whatever it is that we're living in, okay? Social status, all kinds of things are considered. That's why we call it materialist. Is that clear? Okay. Neo-historicists argue that to ask about the relationship between literature and history is the wrong question. So they're saying that those three people before, that the three different schools, the three different models that we spoke about, they got it all wrong. They say because they're asking what's the relationship between history and literature. They say that's not the good question to ask. It's a wrong question, right? We shouldn't be asking that. This is what they believe. They say we should not be asking that question. The question should be something else. The form of the question presupposes that there is literature on one side and history on the other. That's why they refuse it. It's as if saying that when they say history means the circumstances, the context. As if there is, as if an artist, a writer lives in some remote area somewhere by himself or by herself and producing that stuff, producing whatever they produce. And so we consider that literature is something that has nothing to do with society, with culture, with history, with politics, with ideology, with all of those things that we call the material conditions of life. So those two cannot be separated. That's why the question is wrong. Despite the differences, neo-critics, background critics, and reflection, what we call reflectionists, the first three models above, tend to rely on reflectionists. By the way, is the third one, the ones that say that a literary text is a historical document. A piece of art is also a historical document. We call it reflection because it reflects the history. It reflects a period. Okay? Tend to rely on precisely such a polarity. Those three first models, except the one that we talked about as neo-historicist or cultural studies, the first three ones live on this, and they're basically founded on polarity. You understand the two poles. Polarity means that there are two things, one here, one here. They're the opposite. The polarity of literature on this side and history on this side. Okay? That's the basic assumption of all those three different schools. What is the third one? The fourth one is one that breaks down this, and it goes with the question, with the sense in post-structuralism. The first thing that they come after is the polarities, or what we call the oppositions, the binary oppositions. Are you aware of this? I talked about this before. Binary opposites, when you say man-woman, for example, black-white, right? Good-evil. And when we do this, and they are what we call, in anthropology, this started with anthropology, actually, that started thinking this way, that cultures can be understood by this form, this pattern, or these binaries, these oppositions. What we consider evil and what we consider good are essential in constructing a culture and in constructing a society. We all agree, for example, what is bad and what is good, right? And so, but in a post-structuralist way, because these are also structures, that's why they call it post-structuralism, because when you understand society and culture in terms of structures, like good, evil, right? Black, white, this, that, etc., those different things, okay? When you understand society like that, we're reducing society to a set of structures, and those structures connect and make a society. But they say no. Actually, in evil, there may be some good. Or in what we consider good, if we look closely, we may find something actually bad in it. It's not like they're not absolute. They are relative. And so they can't stand like that. We have to separate the two. We have to dismantle this way of thinking in terms of polarities, in terms of oppositions between this and this and that. Okay? Right. Okay. So this is in the. Literary study, this is René Wellek. René Wellek was a critic, was a 20th century famous critic. And he has a book called Literary Theory, actually. A Theory of Literature. It's a very famous book called A Theory of Literature. And he says here in this essay, literary study differs from historical study in having to deal not with documents, but with monuments, and that the literary critic has direct access to his object, while the historian has to reconstruct a long past event on the basis of eyewitness accounts. See, he's in the middle of the polarity between literature. He says, a literary critics look at what he called it, a monument, right? A work of art. He considers a work of art. But a historian, the historian has to consider, in other words, he has to find eyewitness accounts. He has to find things that people said about an event, right? An account of an event, an eyewitness account of an event. In other words, a historical document, a real historical document, something that says something happened in a certain time. For example, a letter from a king or from a ruler or from a soldier or something that will, substantiate a claim about what happened in the past in a certain country or a certain area. So that the document, in other words, what he meant is that literature is not a historical document, right? Historical documents are quite different. And the work of the historian is not the same as that of a literary critic. He is in one of those three categories that we talked about earlier. He was not a new critic, he was not a new critic, but he was more like in the third category, where the second category basically, the background people, those who look for the background of history. And so they separate the two. For example, for a literary text, you can construct a background without really, having the background influence the text or the production of the text. It's just like the degrees of differences between them are sometimes very minimal. But the important thing is that they separate the two. They separate between history and literature. They say they're not the same, they're not related, etc. So a document can be either a literary document, in that case it is an aesthetic object, even if we can find the historical context in which it was written or produced, and a historical document, for example, a treaty between two governments, right? If you have a treaty or something signed between two governments, then we have, between two countries, then we have a historical document, and we'll read it differently, because that's some kind of a witness. It witnesses to an event. It witnesses to beginning of a relationship between Morocco. For example, the letter that George Washington sent to the King of Morocco in 17, I don't know when, right? That started the relationship between Morocco and the United States in 1777 or 1776 or something like that, after the revolution, after the American Revolution. And so that's something that you can find if you go to the museum in Tangier. There is what they call the American Legation Museum. You can find those letters in a box, and you can read them. One written in Arabic, the one that the King of Morocco sent to George Washington, and also the letter that George Washington sent to the King of Morocco, and both, they're both there. And you can consider those are historical documents. They're not literary texts, but you can read them as literary texts if you want. Right? There is something that we will see in actually how historians and writers are no different, because they're both using the same styles, usually. We'll see that. So for all historicist critics, history is not so much textual as more simply a series of empirically verifiable events. History is a series of events that can be verified. We can find them, we can find proof, we can find evidence of things that happened. And so that's history for them. Right? But it has nothing to do, in other words, the language in which history is written is objective. That's what they mean, that's what they believe. That history is objective. I mean, history as a text, history that we read, for example, in school or the history books. They say the language used in history books is completely objective. It has nothing to do with literature. We'll see that it's totally not true. that is completely not objective at all, in that sense. Objective, like scientific objective. No, that doesn't exist. Nothing like that actually exists. They also assume that it is possible for our knowledge of both historical events and literary texts to be detached and objective outside the forces of history. In other words, can be completely objective and detached, right? I read the text without any kind of involvement on my side, right? In other words, my interests, my way of thinking, my outlook on the world, the way I see the world itself, my own vision of how society is or how it should be, does not impinge, does not have any influence on the way I read, I don't know, Shakespeare or Charlotte Bronte or any text, right? And that for the later school of criticism is not true. We only read from perspective. We read from our context. We do not read in a void, right? We read from who we are, from our history, from our relationships, etc. As you can see, for example, the people who are rereading texts from the 19th century, 18th century, etc., and especially what we call post-colonialism, when post-colonial thinkers, we've seen Edward Said, for example. I gave you the example of Orientalism or Culture and Imperialism. These are books that he wrote, and those are books that he wrote from a completely different perspective. He's reading them as a person who is originally from the Middle East. And so he sees, for example, how Western culture, European and American culture, especially European, constructs lots of stereotypes, turns stereotypes into a whole discourse about the Orient, their question of the Orient, turning it into something, a fantasy that exists only in their minds. And so they are constructing and reconstructing a vision from their context, from their own stereotypes and whatever they have on these countries and cultures. And he's reading the total opposite. He says, well, that's not exactly what you're doing. You're just mirroring your own desires and your own fantasies about these countries, about these cultures, etc. And so he's reading them from his own context, from political, oppositional, by sense of opposition, because he opposes that kind of thinking that stereotypes people, that reduces people to stereotypes, or cultures to a set of stereotypes. Cultures are complex. You can't reduce a culture to one thing or two things or three, right? The culture is very complex and diversified and changing and evolving. It's not the same. It never stays the same from 1 year to the next. From like progressively through history, cultures change. Moroccan culture now is not the same as it was 50 years ago, right? Moroccan society is not what it was when I was like 10 or 15. It's completely different now. And so we can't read with the same thing. So there is no constant fixed meaning in things. Things evolve, they change with the time, right? Okay, so new historicism may be understood as a reaction because, we'll see that now how new historicism is actually completely different and how it goes against those ideas that we just exposed earlier. Maybe understood as a reaction against such presuppositions. But briefly, it may be defined as a recognition of the extent to which history is textual, is a text, right? It is written in language. History cannot be outside of language. There is no history without language. You still have to talk. Remember the things we did about narrative. History is a narrative, and there are narratives, and we speak about national narratives today, right? We don't talk about ideologies anymore. We do, but we say a national narrative. What is our national narrative in Morocco? That's the language. What is the national narrative? That we are. Where do you find it? If you want to find the official narrative, where would you go and seek it? If somebody says, what is your national narrative in Morocco? Where would you find that? Yeah, concretely. Because you can go and read and talk and listen and think about our culture, about what we say, what we do, our cultural events, the way we do things, etc. But you can simply go to the Constitution. You know the Constitution of Morocco? There is a Constitution, by the way. You know that. You know that we have something called the Constitution in this country. Like in every country there is a Constitution except England. I mean, they do have a Constitution, but it's not written. So it's like there is no Constitution, but there is one, and there is none. I mean, if you look for the Constitution of England, you will not find it. But everybody talks about the Constitution in England, except that nobody can find what it is, because it's not written in a text. The Americans have one. The only country in the world that has one Constitution that did not change for over 200 years, except a few amendments that they added to change a few things, because it's sacred. But our Constitution says who we are as a nation. Morocco is a country in North Africa. Our identity is composed of this and this and that. You know, who we are, our language, or our languages, right? Our system, our social system, our economic system, our political system. It talks about that. That's the national narrative. That's the ideology. That's what we Moroccans agreed on and devoted for, and it was adopted in 2011, right? After the Arab Spring, after the events of February 20th movement and the things, right? So that's what you call a national narrative. And so our history is written from that perspective. But there are lots of other histories, alternatives to that one, of course. Because, you know, historians look for different things. They look for different meanings. They look for different things that have not been said. A historian is not looking for what has been said, or in what has been said, something else that has been left out. Right? The history of Morocco, as we know it, as we knew it, was, basically excluding lots of things. Excluding, for example, the Amazigh culture was not mentioned in our history. Or it was mentioned only marginally. That's something that's not important, whereas it's the main thing, right? Anyway, so history is textual. History is written as a text, as a narrative, exactly like any other text, as a rejection of the autonomy of the literary text, and as an attempted displacement of the objectivity of interpretation in general. So that's what they say. They say, this is what neo-historicism is about, right? Recognition of the extent to which history is textual as a rejection of the autonomy of the literary text, right? A literary text is not autonomous, unlike the new critics who believe that it is an autonomous object. As an attempted displacement of the objectivity of interpretation in general. In other words, this is what it does. It's a displacement of the objectivity of interpretation. In other words, the objectivity of interpretation, like I said about earlier, those who believe that it can be completely objective, that you can write history objectively, that you can write literature objectively, criticism, be objective. You know, people ask you to be objective by not saying I, for example. At school, when they say, don't say I, right? Don't say I in an essay. I'm sure some teachers may have said that. In order to be objective, you should not say I did, I went, etc. But and then what do you replace it with? Have you had this before? Teachers asking you not to write with I? So what do you write instead? If you don't say I, huh? They? Who? Is there a subject? We? Huh? It seems to me? Well, me.
For example, it seems to be on shows.
Yeah? Okay, well, anyway, you see, it's complicated, right? In other words, you can't write from... you know, what they say, displacement of the objectivity. In other words, that that interpretation can never be objective. You know, even doctors, when you go to see a doctor and you give them, you do blood work, blood analysis, you give it to a doctor, and they will give you something, and you say, well, I need a second opinion. You go to a doctor in the same specialty, and you give him that thing, and he might give you something quite different. Right? That's why people, or at least I'm not talking about medication. I'm talking about your diagnosis. Right? The diagnosis changes from one doctor. That's why people keep going from one doctor to the next. Say, well, I went to him, he gave me something, didn't do anything, so I'm going to this one. And then when they're lost, they don't know what to do, they go to Fiqh. They go to something else, completely different. Anyway, or to someone who knows some alternative medicine, some magic. But anyway, so what it means is that diagnosis is like it's the same. What I'm saying here, I think 2 years ago, because last year I didn't teach criticism, but the year before I taught the class and I told them, how can criticism save your life? Yeah. Well, save your life is a metaphor for many things. How can it do good to you? How can it help you in any way? Huh? How can you apply it in life? How can we apply criticism in life? By criticizing people? No. You just make them angry and they will be mad at you. In other words, does it have anything to do with our lives and how we live our lives? Or is it just about text and words and papers and stuff that we do at school? It's a question, it's not rhetorical. I think I will ask you this question in the exam. I will probably ask you this question in the exam. Write an essay in which how criticism applies in life, in daily life, in your daily life. That should work. Think about that. Right? Okay, we practice it every day. No? Don't we? I mean, I don't know about you, but it depends what you do in your life. But for example, for someone who has if you have a car or or a motorbike or something, and you take it and it has a problem, you take it to a mechanic and he doesn't, he does some poor job, or it tells you that this is what's wrong with it, because he's like a doctor. They're doctors for cars. Mechanics are doctors for cars. Or if you want, doctors are mechanics of the human body, right? Psychologists are mechanics of the human mind. They're mechanics, basically. And so because they make a diagnosis, say, okay, from the signs, in other words, they look at the signs, they look at the things that they can find, what's wrong. I mean, before they get into what's wrong, but they look at the manifestations of the wrong thing, which is still a mystery. And then from those signs, they make an interpretation. And based on their interpretation, they gave you a diagnosis. This is, based on what I saw, this is the problem. And then a doctor gives you medication. A mechanic takes his toolbox and starts opening the car to fix it. All right? A literary critic is the same. You, for example, you read the text and say, well, tell me something about this thing. There is something wrong in this text. There is something in this text. I need to know what it is. And so you take the text and you bring your toolbox as well, as critics, because you also have a toolbox, except that it's not material tools, it's in your heads. And then you start working with the text. You take words by word, phrases, symbols, whatever there is, and connections and stuff and ideas, and then you say, well, from this is what I find. And then you turn that into a narrative. That's the final diagnosis, and you tell me, well, this is what I found in this text. Okay, but you will give me different ones because you are different. Just like a mechanic can give you the same things as well. Good mechanic can give you a good diagnosis. A bad one give you a bad diagnosis. Just like good doctors can give you a good diagnosis, and a bad doctor will give you something completely different. Right? And then they fix the problem. When you think about things like this, you are doing criticism. That is exactly what we're talking about. You take something, an object, you look at it, you look at it, you look at the signs, you look at the things, and you try to make sense out of it. Based on lots of things, based on your knowledge, based on your experience, based on how you know, how much you know, etc. You can make a good thing or a bad thing out of it, or something, medium. Do you understand the analogy? Right? Because that's what it is. This is what it is about. It's about the skills, about these skills of knowing how to do things. It's not about learning new criticism and new whatever. That's not important. That is absolutely not important. What is important is these ways of looking at things, and how if we take them as separate, we miss the whole point. But if we take them together, then we have made something. We achieved something. Okay? If you have questions, please don't. Yes?
Saying that those are the aims of this course, the objectives of this course.
What discourse?
Criticism.
No, criticism, that's what we're talking about, right?
Criticism.
Literary criticism, yeah. The objectives? The objectives? Yes. Which ones? Huh? We're talking about literary criticism.
Yeah.
Okay. You say discourse, and I don't know. Of?
This course.
Oh, this course. Oh, I thought you said discourse. Yeah. Of the course. Yes. Those are the objectives. That's what I'm teaching you. Not to learn the things, not to learn the concepts, not to go and see, okay, your criticism is cool, that started with this and it is that and that. No, I don't care about that. I don't even want you to talk about that.
This is how questions.
Huh?
Questions about
Yeah, ask questions. Yeah, that's what it is. Just basically how to think. How to think. We all think, but we have to think methodically, let's say. It's a method of thinking. It's a way of thinking. In other words, we have to think with reason. We have to think reasonably. We have to argue. We have, how we construct an argument. Because we do this all the time. Like as I said, we do that. We practice it every day without thinking. We go to the doctor, we go to the pharmacist, we go to the guy who sells sponge. You buy sponge from this guy is not the same from this other guy. It relates to life. It's not completely different. It's not like something you do this at the school and that's it. It's something you do at school, of course, but it's something also that has a bearing on life. I mean, it's related to what we do. It's just our way of behaving and thinking. And relations with people also are based on that. How we understand people. Does it make sense?
Yes.
I don't know if the whole thing makes sense to you, but this is how I teach. This is why I stopped, actually for a while I stopped teaching criticism, because I found out that in whichever way I try to teach it, students still think of it as something they have to learn, like memorize and give it back to me. And so I said, okay, I'm not going to teach this anymore until I think about it in a different way. But every time it comes back. So this is what I'm telling you. Don't think like that. It's not about learning stuff from the exam and from the course and giving back to me. It's actually learning. What the whole point is that that the way we deal with things is the way we deal with. What it says is that take the way we deal with texts and use them for your life. It's the same. That things do not have. There are many perspectives in which we can see things. We don't see it only from one side. We're not one-dimensional people. We have to see it from different perspectives. That there are different perspectives to anything. Right? That's why, for example, when you hear a story of something happened, like 2 days ago, we heard somebody in Ujda killed the whole family. But there were so many stories. Everybody was saying something different. Oh, there's like a guy who killed his mother and his sister and his wife and his daughter. And then somebody says, no, he's just a neighbor who got like crazy, who killed everyone in the neighborhood. Or something. So you have so many stories, and we don't know which one is real. Right? And so we have to take all of the stories, put them together, and maybe at the end we'll find some clue to what actually happened. Well, just like the police does too. You do police work. You look at the signs, you try to make sense of what it is. And that's a lesson in life. It's like, this is what it does. This is what it's all about. Anyway, let's go on. So, in the first place, then, the new historicism involves a question of the critic's own position and interpretive procedures. See, that when I say this, I don't know. This is what because if we just like read it like that and think about it in this way, is there something you will take that sentence and learn it and repeat it, right? Without thinking. When are you going to be done talking? Those two of you. Okay. So, when it says this, for example, questioning the critic's own position and interpretative procedures. Do you understand that? Questioning the interpretive positions of the critic, or his own position, or her own position. Where you stand, where you come from, who you are, your prior knowledge, your assumptions, your culture, your ideas, your ideology, your way of thinking, your way of seeing the world, your view, or your worldview. Right? We read subjectively. And when we read subjectively, then we are conscious that we are reading subjectively, because we know that there is no such a thing as reading objectively. And so you know, and you are conscious, and you're aware that your reading is limited by who you are, by your past, your background, your history, your culture, your knowledge, your beliefs. Right? That's what you read from. You encounter this every day. We encounter this, for example, consider examples, for where you think about Ramadan, for example, in a Western culture. How do you think about it? Or about Laylat al-Kabir. Moroccans live in European countries, and they have to do the sacrifice. And then you have all these Europeans looking at them and saying, why are they doing this? And they don't understand it. They say, why do you do it? Do you have to do it? Right? Even when you say that, or if whatever they say about it in the news or in the media or something, it's related to their own culture. It's related to their own perspective from their own societies. And so they don't get it. Or maybe they do sometimes. Some get it, most don't. And so they don't understand why people have to do it, even if it's complicated. I mean, you live in a small apartment and you still have to kill a sheep in your house or in your apartment. How would you do that? Where would you do it? And then they have the city that says, no, this is illegal, you can't do this, it's a problem, so it's against the law, it's against this, against that, etc. So they get into all these complications because they want to perform a ritual, a religious ritual that they are used to do in their countries, but they can't do it there, etc. Because the dominant culture is the one that does not perform that thing, right? And so if for example, some cities in Europe say you are not allowed to, because the law in those countries, for example, is that you are, as a citizen, anyone, you're not allowed to get your own meat by killing an animal at home. But that's the law. If you want meat, go buy it from the butcher, buy it from the supermarket. But you can't do that yourself. Unless you live in the country where there is no such thing, then you can hunt. Maybe you kill a deer and then bring it home and kill it and eat it. But most of the time, it's illegal because they say there is a question of hygiene, etc. And so the question of hygiene is very important. The perspective of hygiene in European countries is extremely important. We start to have that too here. We look at things from you understand hygiene? I hope, right? You don't want to get germs. You don't want to eat something that kills you or makes you sick or give it to someone to kill someone else. Okay, and so those are things that come from a certain context. And when people practice certain things, certain like rituals like that, they are faced with this law, with this way of thinking in those countries that are, for them it's normal not to do that. And for the others, no, why not? Right? Saying, No, we do it back in my country. We have no problem with that. And so whoever is speaking about this, for example, from a Western perspective, they would see it as something that's for them it's incomprehensible because they don't have it in their cultural codes. It's not part of it, and so they're reading from their perspective. Right? So their position is that of person who comes from that culture, the dominant culture, and looks at those things as completely irrational or strange, to say the least. Okay? So we do the same. This is an example, practical example on how we deal with text, for example. I remember when I was a student at the university in France, at the Sorbonne University, there was a friend, there was a Moroccan guy. He's from here, actually, from Oujda. I met him the first time I heard about Oujda was from him. I mean, I didn't know anyone from Oujda before. But, we talked, and he was doing a presentation, and he was talking about a novel by Iris Murdoch. I can't remember which one. But in that novel, there is a description of a scene between a man and a woman, right, engaged in a love-making scene, and he was speaking about it in moral terms, right? He was moralizing. In other words, he was saying that this is wrong, that this is religiously unacceptable, etc. And everybody in the seminar, all these French, Italians, English, American people, and German in the seminar, so many people, were looking and listening. Well, that's interesting. But he was reading from where he comes from. He was reading from his own culture. And he looked at him and said, are you? They had a reaction. Everybody had like a moment. And he said, okay. He looked, like he was a little bit surprised by the reaction. But when we went outside, we started discussing this, and I told him, he told me, why did he do that? I told him, because you're talking from a completely different context. Your culture and their culture, that in their culture, they don't judge, basically, moral judgment. They don't pass moral judgment on people. Or they at least learn not to pass moral judgments on others. Not because they want to be objective, but they say, we have to, it's more complicated than the thing that we saw. In other words, we have to see behind that. We have to see if there is a love relationship that you don't understand for them. For example, those two people have a love relationship, so for them it's okay. But for him, no, it's not okay. Even if there is a love relationship, it should not go to the point of having a sexual intercourse or something like that. In other words, he was looking at that, and so it's strange, right? Because he was reading this from a completely different perspective, and he was reading from that. And so, but he was not aware of his position. That's the thing. He was not aware, which neo-historicism and cultural studies ask you to do, is when you read, you have to be aware of your position, and so you be careful when you read. Right? Because you're aware of your position. This is something that also was very important in anthropology. When you have those people who's doing ethnographic work, they go, for example, into some village in some remote area and start living with people. You are not one of them. If you do anthropological study, you are not part of the people you're studying. Mostly a European guy comes from university, from upper class, etc. society, and comes to a country, a poor country in South America or in Africa or in Morocco, and lives with people and describe their life and try to make sense of their cultural practices and social structures, etc. But they did it before. They used to that's what we call colonial anthropology. Colonial anthropology did not ask the question of power. The person who comes to a remote village in some area and study it, from that perspective, he's basically, standing above and having that high status over them, superiority, etc., and unconscious of it, or maybe even conscious of it but doesn't care, but without paying attention to that, whatever he says or she says about those people comes from that position, from his position as someone who's outsider, who basically looks at these people as primitive or something, and also that comes from that the power, the sense of power comes from coming from a culture that is superior, that is rich, that dominates. And so whatever he says or she says about those people will be colored by that position, by that perspective. Just like my friend who was in this seminar, he was talking, and whatever he was saying was colored by his vision, by his background culture that was intervening inside in his own way of looking at things and understanding things. You understand this? Okay? So that's why they say that you have to be, they say, that question the critic's own position, to question your own position. In other words, to say, what I'm saying is related or is determined by who I am, where I come from, or where I stand. Okay? Not objective. I'm not just a camera looking. I am also a person who comes with baggage, a person who comes with stuff in their heads. That's the new historical perspective. All right, so new historicists argue that the production of literary text is a cultural practice. That is extremely important. A literary text is a cultural practice. You know why the novel never took off in the Arab culture? What is the main literary genre in Arabic culture? I mean, we have riwayah, we have lots of people who write novels, but it's not the major one. There are lots of good writers and they have really great books. There's so many. But for people, it's not. I mean, how many people do you see reading books on a train? For example, reading a novel on a train, or in a cafe, or while waiting for the bus, or at the dentist, or at the doctor's, or in some administration while waiting for some clerk to finish some paper for you. Never, almost never. Even now, today is even worse because everybody has a phone, so they just look at their phones. But even before that, people did not really read books. In European culture, in Western culture in general, the novel is part of the culture, of the popular culture. That's why they have, for example, books that sell like 5 million, 6 million copies. And they call them bestsellers. Millions of copies are sold. Harry Potter sold like I don't know how many millions of copies. Because people read. And children, everybody wants to read it. So they say, no, I want to get it. So people, line up to get the book before it's like out of print. That doesn't happen in our culture, even whatever it is, but it will never happen like that. Okay? And so it's something completely different. Huh? So the novel is a cultural practice. It is a cultural practice. In those cultures, it is part of the culture. People read less now than they used to, but there is still that. There's still, people still read. When someone is holding an electronic device, you don't know if they're reading a book or doing something, because now you can read on a phone or on a tablet or something, but they're still reading the book, and the novel becomes something really popular and people buy it everywhere. In our country, for example, a book that sells 5,000 copies is considered a bestseller. That's not even publishable in European countries. For example, if the publisher knows that your book will not sell more than 5,000 copies, they will not publish it. They say, oh no, that's nothing. That's what we sell in one small town. and so it's strange. But it's a cultural practice. And so that's why they say production of literary text is a cultural practice. But we do have different forms. We have other things that are common and that are working. Different only in its specific mode or formulation from other practices. It's only the mode that changes because it's a cultural practice, and it's the mode of that cultural practice, the way it's done, is what makes it different from other forms. That's why I said, for example, that we don't have that kind of thing. We have it, but it's very small, so it's minor. But the mode of its production or the mode of its practice, the way it is done, is what makes it different, for example, from other things that are done in society, other cultural practices that we have in our culture. Right? More concretely, writing history or writing novels are basically the same thing. The only difference is that they have different approaches to it, but basically they're the same. A cultural practice, when something is a cultural practice, the only thing that differs it from making films, for example, is that it's the medium, right? Making a film or writing a book, producing a book or producing a film. Both are cultural practices, and so they are different. In one is something that we see, and one is something that we can hold and read, right? But they are cultural practices. And so they are the same, and they are subjected to the same things, right? There is still someone who is behind it, someone who has to think about it, someone who has to connect things to make things happen. In both cases, basically the structure is the same. From other parts, from furniture making and teaching, etc. So they are all, connected, and they're all the same, according to neo-historians. According to this reason, there is no absolute distinction between literary and other cultural practices. When they say that there is no distinction, it means that they are connected. That we cannot say, for example, that this is history and this is literature. I will give you examples of how they think about, where is it? Not yet, but it's probably the next slide. For example, there is this critic and historian, what we call a historiographer, a person who writes history, but who writes about history as well, is like a theorist of history, who does analysis of novels and historical books. And his argument is that both historians and fiction writers use the same techniques. They tell stories. They use symbolism, they use all kinds of tropes that we connect to that. There is narrative, there is a narrator, there is character, you have characters, you have fans, you have stuff, and it's the same. They're telling novels, they're telling history just the way people tell stories. So he said, we can't say that the language used in history books is objective, whereas that of literature is subjective, etc. So we'll see about that. Literary texts are embedded within the social and economic circumstances in which they are produced and consumed. But what is important for historicists is that these circumstances are not stable in themselves and are susceptible to being rewritten and transformed. Like I told you earlier about culture and society, how it's never fixed, how it's evolving and changing, constantly changing. And so as it changes, the practices changes, all practices changes. Whether it's about writing or reading, it's the same. The way we read today is not the same we read in the past. Now, even now, if you want to read, for example, you can read on your phones, you can read on computers, on tablets, right? In the past, for example, if you look at how people read before, even with the appearance of television and radios, people start to read less because there is something else that changes. You have somebody else talking, you have language coming, entertainment coming from a TV or from a radio station, you listen. But before that, people sat down and read books, right? They sat as families and read books to one another. I mean, like somebody reads for the whole family, or they read individually or something as a form of entertainment. And so that's a practice, but it changed over time. In societies, technology changed, and so the reading habits also change. And the consumption and of culture changes too, right? Right, so from this perspective, literary texts are part of a larger circulation of social energies. It's not just something that's completely up, but it's part of a whole system of exchange, if you want, system of relations and exchange of things. Both products and influences on a particular culture or ideology. What is new about new historicism in particular, is its recognition that history is the history of the present. This is what Michel Foucault says. It's always a history of the present. Literary texts are part of something called historicism. In particular, is the recognition that history is the history of the present. He calls it history is in the making, rather than being monumental and closed. In other words, history is not finished. History is always in the making. In other words, we make our history as we go. We write history today. It's present time and it's historical at the same time. History is not something that is out there somewhere. It's part of us. I don't know if you have taken the extensive reading with me last year, those of you, where we've studied Out of This World. It's a novel called Out of This World, and it is exactly about this. And it's that history is not happening outside of the individual life, right? The narrator of the story, who was a photographer, lived history, and history impacted his life. And it is history, history in the form of events happening outside, or things that, the world history itself influences and has an impact on every individual, and the characters in the book all suffer from the impact of history, of what happened in that period. So it comes to them. So we cannot get the individual. We can't be outside of history. We can't be like today, for example, we are affected by history today. I mean, history in the form of, for example, if we want to think about big events, well, you look at the Russian-Ukrainian war, right? Or the pandemic or something, and how we are not outside of it. We can't say, oh no, that has no impact on our life. It does, right? The war between Russia and Ukraine today has an impact on every one of us because it made things, expensive, right? Everything has become so expensive because of that. And so history that's happening out there, is hurting us. And, people lost their jobs in the pandemic, also same thing. The businesses that have to close and all of those things. And those are things that happen that we did not create ourselves, but we are part of that. And so we are involved in it. And so history is in the present. It's not something of the past, but it's also of the present, right? Okay, history is in the making rather than being monumental and closed. History is radically open to transformation and rewriting. When they say that, in other words, we can rewrite history as we go. There is not one version of history. There are many versions of history. Right? There are many. That's why historians, for example, if you study history, and at the end you have to write a thesis, for example. Or, for example, when you read, in the sixth semester, you will have to write a research paper, and that research paper, whatever subject you want to touch on or you want to study, it's already been studied before. Right? Any subject you think about, somebody has written something about it. It's already there. So you're not going to invent something completely different. You take a novel and a short story, whatever you want to work on, or social media, whatever, poverty, any situation you want to talk about, or any topic you want, has already been talked about and discussed extensively. And so what you bring in to it is your point of view, is your perspective on things, your analysis of it, your difference, how you differ from what has been said. You try to do a little bit. Even if you don't do that, because it's not always easy to do that, especially when it's a complicated topic. But what you can do is, if you put those things in a synthetic view of what happened, of things, right, about the subject, you are producing something else, because you're bringing all these different things, different versions or different ideas, and connecting them and discussing them. That's your input. That's what you do. That's what you bring into it. That's your contribution. Okay? That's why it's called research. You go and research what people have said about something, then you put them together and try to read them differently. You may add things, you may bring something new if you're brilliant, Or you can also be brilliant by simply taking all those things and reformulating them in a completely different way. And so there is always rewriting. It happens in history, it happens in politics, in literature, in everything. Okay. So new historicists argue that any knowledge of the past is necessarily mediated by texts. We've already seen this before. What we know about the past comes to us through texts. There is nothing outside the text. Remember this? We have texts, everything. Or, to put it differently, that history is in many respects textual. We call it textual. And remember that why we insist on text so much? Why do we insist on text all the time? We say history is textual, it's all text, everything is text. Why do we say that? Saved? No, not because of that. I mean, even in text it can't be saved sometimes. It may or may not be saved, even in the text. No, because the idea of a text is related to what? To words, to narrative, to language, right? But you look at text, the word itself. Like if you want to do some kind of etymology of the word text, text is fabric. Fabric? Fabric. The things that we wear, clothes, right? They're made of fabric. We call textiles, right? Textile. And fabric is made of what? Of wool, strings of wool, right? Wool or cotton or synthetic stuff. But if you take a piece of cloth and you look at it, what do you see? Holes, yes. But what's between holes? What's outside of the holes? Huh? It's, huh?
There's too many
Plots? Oh, yeah. Like knots or something? Like connected. You see so many strings. You say basically strings crisscrossed, right? In other words, the machine that makes the fabric brings, because when, you've seen that, I'm sure you know this. The machine that makes the fabric, that makes it into one piece, brings all kinds of, brings together lots of strings and put them together, right? There is this machine that puts them together, and then at the end you have that, you have this, or something. The idea of bringing those things together is exactly the same thing in text. A text is not made of one thing. It's a metaphor. We use that textile metaphor to speak about text because a text is a combination of many things. It can be a combination of different texts, but it can be combinations of ideologies, combinations of cultures, combinations of things, of ideas, of all kinds of things. A text, the idea, whenever you hear someone talking about text or textuality, it's because there is a combination, right? There is like the work of a textile machine. Like a fabric. A text is a fabric made up of so many things. And it's in that many things, that idea of that there are so many different things inside it that makes it interesting, that makes it distinctive. In other words, it's not monolithic, it's not one thing, but it's many things at the same time. It looks like one thing, like jeans, for example, the denim, the cloth that we call denim. It looks like one thing. It's like plastic. I don't know. It's not plastic. I mean, it looks like one thing, but it is not. And there is nothing actually that is not there. In physics, most of you have studied physics in high school, right? You all have a science baccalaureate, most of you. And you studied science, and in science, in physics, for example, you learn that everything is composed of and molecules are more of what? Atoms, etc. And even the human skin, the human body, if you look at if you have like those extremely powerful microscopes, when you look at your skin under those things, what? This is what? You will be surprised to look at how your skin is actually made. It's so many, lots of little things put together. They're just sitting there. You say, what connects them? I don't know. But they're connected, and they make you who you are, right? And so everything is connected. There is not one thing that is just one thing. like a monolith. We call a monolith is something that is even iron, even gold, even it can be, made up. When you analyze it, you'll find that it's made up of so many molecules and so many things inside. And so, like a text is also something. So we take that metaphor and we apply it to things, because usually we think of text as something, it's like one thing. It's like, but it's actually, when you look at it, you find that it brings in so many. It's like a culture. Our culture, for example, today, our culture in Morocco, is not something that is monolithic. It's, look at the history of the country, all the people that have been here, the Romans, the Phoenicians, the Arabs, the Spanish, the French. Everybody left something in this country. And it's the same everywhere. And people came from different places. And they all have different things. And so the culture, if you analyze, you will find that it's not one thing. It's many things. Because it's a rich background. It's made of that. So that's why we talk about text. And we use it mostly to deconstruct ideologies. When you talk about text, is because we don't want, especially ideologies are related to power. And so by, for example, an ideology that wants to take power, to hold power over the others, to rule and to be the dominant ideology, the way because it presents itself as monolithic, as one thing. All ideologies present themselves as being like a monolith. I lost many of my words. As the truth, okay? It presents itself as the truth. And we have an idea that there is something called the truth, as an absolute truth, right? And so ideologies present themselves as the truth, the valid truth, the only valid truth that everybody should take or accept, right? And so, so you see, all the criticism of the second part of the 20th century had to do with this. At the background, it's ways of resisting ideology. Because ideology presents itself as the truth and nothing but the truth, the only truth, right? And the way to debunk this, to show its limits, is by finding these alternative ways of looking at things and saying, no, that's not how it works. Things are more complex. Right? It's more complicated than that. So what you present as the truth, there are alternative truths. There are other ways of looking at things. There are other ways of understanding things. There are other ideologies around. There are lots of things. And even yours is just one among so many. And so what is it that gives you the authority to dominate by your view or your views on the world? And so I think of it personally, I think of it as a little bit anarchic. Anarchy. Yeah? Anarchy is a system where it's not Foudan. Anarchy is not that. As a philosophical system, it's a constant question of legitimacy of power. What is it that legitimates, that gives legitimacy, sharia, to power or to holding power over the others? And it says there is no justified authority. In the thinking of anarchists, they say no authority can be justified. You cannot justify it by any means. If you justify it, that's ideology. And if it's ideology, then it's just a way of things that you want to impose on others. Do you understand this? Okay. So that's behind. This is the things behind all. The philosophy behind all of these forms of ways and of thinking and analyzing, etc. It's resisting domination, resisting hegemony, some ways of reading. And so it goes on like this. And now with these new ways of thinking, especially in criticism, it's impossible to present something as hegemonic anymore. Okay, wherever you go, people will always oppose to you something by which they try to undermine the authority or the power of a certain discourse. Okay? Okay, so what time is it? It's 10 to 12. Okay, a number of major consequences follow from such an assertion. So here are therefore, the consequences, the results of all of that kind of thinking is the first place, there can be no knowledge of the past without interpretation. Any knowledge of the past is an interpretation. Any text is an interpretation of reality. There is a reality. We don't even know if there is a reality anymore because we only have versions of it. Reality is gone. I mean, we're here, but after a while, and then when we're not here, what we've been talking about ceases to be a reality. It will become a memory, and it will be a video recorded of it. But it's gone. We have only a version of it, a recorded, a memorable, something that we remember, but not the real thing. And so, in the first place, there can be no knowledge of the past without interpretation. The fact is precisely what there is not. Right? You say, it's a fact. You say, wait a minute. Not only interpretations, they say. It's, some people would think this is nihilistic or this is like negative or like pessimistic or something. When you say this is a fact, it's problematic to say that, by the way. When you say, for example, facts, there are no facts. So you ask the question, was colonialism a fact or was it not? It's a problem. I mean, if you say that nothing is a fact, then, well, colonization was a fact. Suffering is a fact. Right? Oppression is a fact. Those are things that cannot be ignored. You can't say, no, it's just an interpretation. No, it is not an interpretation. It's something that happened, especially if you suffered from it. Massacres are a fact. Right? Holocausts are the facts. Wars are facts. So, even in this, even when you hear this, don't think that it's the thing that's all there is. There is always a problem. This, they turn it, but, it's a use from the will to power from Nietzsche. He says, for example, he says that facts is precisely what there is, not only interpretations. It's very limited in scope because there are lots of facts. Right? Now, the facts exist. How they exist is the problem. How they are remembered is the problem. You understand? Things happen and they are facts. But then what is left is a memory, a document, a text. The text does not cancel the fact. It has a trace of the fact in it. There is a trace of the fact in it. And to what extent is it faithful to the fact? That's where you can ask questions. Okay? Something happens, there is no doubt, that's a fact. What is left of it is versions. And so that's where we have to be very careful how to deal with facts. Even colonialism, even massacres, even lots of things. So we have to be careful how to deal with those. We can't just take them like that. If the version of the fact that we get was from the perpetrator, it will be colored. If it comes from the victim, it will be colored. If it becomes someone who is not a victim or perpetrator, it will still be colored. And so the truth is somewhere between those. You have to have all of those things to have an idea of what the truth is. Right? It's like 5 or 6 blind people, you present them with something, because they don't see it totally, they can only touch. One who touches the nose of the animal. So there is a story about an elephant presented to some people. I'm sure that some of the teachers may have given you this example in linguistics. Right? Those blind people who were presented with an elephant, and they did not know it was an elephant, and so they were all touching, and this is something, they describe what they have touched. Say, this is this, it's this, it's that, it's this. But none of them got the whole thing. Right? They all got only parts of it. And so it's the same. You have to put them together to get something. It's like a puzzle, basically broken into pieces. You have to put them together. And even putting them together is also problematic. Anyway, it doesn't end. But it keeps you thinking. So just as literary texts need to be read, so do the facts of history. So that reading is what I'm saying about. Facts exist, but we read them. We have to read them, and we read them from what other people have read in them too. because we're not there to see the fact. We only see the version. What's left of it is a trace, a document, a testimony, an eyewitness, or something. And so we do with that. We read those previous readings of a fact. All right? Clear? Okay. Oh, this is where I'm talking about that historian. So Hayden White suggests that our knowledge of the past is determined by particular narrative configurations. In other words, the way it was narrativized to us, the way it came to us as a narrative, the historical knowledge, that in talking about the past, we tell stories. The past comes to us as stories. We talk about storytelling in politics, right? Right? A storytelling, for example, in general politics, not in specific politics. Yeah, storytelling in politics. For example, you look at any political organization, it has its own storytelling. It has storytelling is actually the description of how they present things, how they explain the situation of the country, for example. It's a storytelling. They have their own story of their own past, and we have done this, and we have done that, and etc. And so the dominant storytelling is the one that uses publicity, that uses all kinds of things, that becomes the dominant one. It's like in elections, for example. So according to White, histories ought never to be read as an ambiguous science of the events they report, but rather as symbolic structures, extended metaphors that liken the events reported in them to some form with which we have already become familiar in our culture, in our literary culture, by the very construction of a set of events in such a way as to make a comprehensible story out of them. The historian charges those events with the symbolic significance of a comprehensible plot structure. In other words, what he's saying, he says that historians work exactly like fiction writers. They do exactly the same thing. They work in the same ways, use the same techniques, use the same tools, same devices, literary devices that novelists use to write history. And that becomes something of a question. Then how do we deal with what is told? How do we make a difference between a literary text and a historical book or a history book? The history, like I said earlier, it talks about events and facts, things that happened, but the way it talks about them, the way it presents them is in the form of a story and a narrative. And that's what makes it a little bit. And that's why we have, for example, you can do the same thing. If you read, for example, about the French Revolution written by those who were very enthusiastic about it, some French people or some English people who were very extremely enthusiastic about the French Revolution, and then you read some other accounts of it by those who were different, that did not exactly see it in that way, you will have two different histories of the same thing. It did exist. I mean, the French Revolution existed, the American Revolution existed, but the way it is told and the way it is construed is completely different depending on who does that. You understand? And so you can see that, and then that's why we don't only, that's why we have, like we said, sometimes we say, we need witnesses, not one, we need many. Because you have different versions. And between all of those versions, the judge needs to make, a decision by taking into account different versions of the same story so that they can come to something close to what really happened. Without denying that nothing happened. So they're not saying nothing happened. Something did happen, we have facts, but we have to be careful how it's told. And now there is even, I was going to open a different perspective on things. It's going to be complicated to finish that. In this respect, the strategies and tools of critical analysis, the one we use for criticism, the consideration of figures and tropes, the critical awareness of the historical elements of the language, and so on, are appropriate to a critical study of history, as they are to literary studies. In other words, a criticism of history, a literary critic can do also the same for historical books too. You can read a historical book as a literary work, and apply into it exact same thing that you do with that. Okay? There is a lot more coming, but it's 12, so we have to stop here. Yes.
I don't know.
What does that mean?
It means you can't find them.
What about people that cannot attend? What about
People who cannot attend. It's unfair to whom?
people that cannot attend? Because each,
Are you saying that I am unfair to them?
I mean, because I don't live here, so
Yeah.
it's unfair for me. I cannot keep living here.
I can't come teach you in your house. I can't come and teach you where you live. I can only teach you here. You want me to come and teach? Where do you live?
No, I'm not saying.
No, I'm just.
I will upload this to the platform.
I will.
That's what.
But I will upload them. Actually, we're filming, right? You see that camera there? It's filming the whole thing, and I'm recording because that thing doesn't record the sound, but this one does. So I'm giving them to the technical service. They're going to put the sound and the video together, and we will put everything on a platform. And that will be available for everyone. For those who cannot attend, like you. That's all I can do, huh?
Yeah, that's not to take weeks.
No. Well, I think I already gave them 6 or 7 lectures. I hope they finished, putting them together. And we will put those first, and then as we go, we put that. But before the end, I'll try to make sure to get everything online before we're done. So I don't know where we're going to put them yet, but I will let you know. If nothing happens, then I will just have to put them on YouTube. It's the most accessible one, even though it takes, hours to upload something to YouTube. But we can do that too. Okay? Thank you.